Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going to be looking at the movie simply called W.E. Released in 2011 and directed by Madonna, the name W.E. stands for Wallace and Edward. That would be Wallace Simpson, the American divorcee, for whom King Edward VIII abdicated the throne. After the abdication, they became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The movie also uses the storyline of a married woman in 1998 who attends the estate auction of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to learn more about them and gain her own courage to leave her abusive marriage. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, I'll be joined by Andrew Loney, the author of Traitor King, the scandalous exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Before we chat with Andrew, though, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm about to say 3 things. 2 of them are true. That means 1 is an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Wally Winthrop's storyline is fictional. Number 2, King Edward VIII's real name was Bertie. Number 3, Wallace Simpson was married twice before Edward. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to find the 2 facts scattered somewhere throughout the episode. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Andrew Loney about the historical accuracy of W.E. Let's start off with a high-level view of the movie. If you were to give this letter grade for historical accuracy, what would it get?
Well, on a rating of 1 to 10, which is 10 is highly accurate, I'd give it a 2.
A 2?
Yeah, the costumes are great. They spent a lot of money. They recreated the costumes. They had jewelry. They did years of research, supposedly. But I'm afraid and in fact, there are bits that they quote, which are quotes from the actual letters that Wallace and Edward wrote. So to that extent, there's some accuracy, but most of it is complete twaddle.
That the official technical term.
And it was panned by the critics, and I think it only took $183,000 at the box office. So it was a real critical disaster as well as commercial disaster. But as you say, the best films are the ones that are perhaps the worst films in terms of talking about this for the program.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Well, at the very beginning of the movie, it does open with some text. It says we're watching Wallace and Winfield Spencer in Shanghai in the year 1924. And right away, we can tell that this is an abusive relationship. Winfield doesn't flinch to grab Wallace. He throws her to the ground. He kicks her while she's down. It's tough to watch. There are a few clues that we can pick up from the movie, such as Winfield storms into the room wearing a military uniform. Wallace cries out, "Not the baby," as Winfield kicks her. How well does the movie do setting up this introduction to Wallace before she became Mrs. Wallace Simpson?
Well, it's an interesting way to start because most people don't realize that she had this period in Shanghai before she married Ernest Simpson. And there was a first marriage at the age of 19 with this guy, Win Spencer, who was abusive, who was an American Air Force captain. And so that is accurate. Now, the question of whether she lost a baby through his abusive actions, I think, is more debatable. There's some suggestions she couldn't have had children. There are other suggestions she couldn't have children later because she had an abortion. So I think there's a big mystery there. But I think it's a slightly odd beginning because we just don't understand how that relates to the abdication.
Honestly, I didn't know. I mean, without that little bit of text, I wouldn't have known that they were married. I mean, just a relationship, perhaps, but not. There wasn't anything in the movie to suggest that.
Exactly. I mean, and, they do mention later in the film that they're married, and they go through this sort of flashbacks. But that period in China was very important for her. It's supposedly where she learned a lot of her sexual tricks that she deployed in later life. There's some mystery about if she was a spy when she was out there. She certainly had lots of affairs then. And later, and indeed during her marriage to the Duke of Windsor, which I don't think people realize.
Wow. So there was a some rumors that she was a spy. I mean, yeah, the movie doesn't even mention that at all.
No, I mean, it's odd because what Madonna is saying is this woman, we see everything through the perspective of how it affected the king and Duke of Windsor rather than through her perspective. And I think what they do well in the film is this idea that she's like a caged bird, that she is trapped in a marriage she doesn't want. And that is accurate. But yeah, there's a whole backstory there, which, you need to read the biographies to really understand.
Wow. Yeah. I watched the movies and I didn't understand that at all. So that's good to know. Yeah. Something else I was curious about, because throughout the movie, it kind of bounces between Wallis Simpson's story and another woman who's in an unhappy marriage with an abusive husband named Wally Winthrop. At one point in the movie, Wally mentions that she was named after Wallis. Wally's story, though, is set in 1998 in New York City. Although the movie I never noticed that it actually mentioned the year in the movie, but in the summary for the movie on the descriptor, when you're watching it, it mentions it there. But the movie itself is kind of vague about the timeline for Wally. It just seems to be more modern times. The impression that I got from the movie overall was that Wally's storyline is completely made up. But I have to ask, is there any historical truth to Wally's story in the movie?
No, it is completely made up. But I suppose there were lots of people, they used the device of the big auction in 1998, where they sold a lot of the artifacts, to introduce her. And I suppose there were lots of people who remain obsessed by the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And there's an appreciation society. People do trade in their artifacts, letters and things like that. So, there could have been someone like that. I mean, she's a sort of composite figure, I suspect. But I've never come across anyone who was as obsessive as that, as to go and trace letters, to go and see Al Fayed, who owned the Bois de Boulogne, the house that they'd had, and owned a lot of the things that they left, like the letters. Okay.
But so the auction was a real thing that happened in 98. So maybe that was the tie that they were using, the filmmakers were using.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is true. That is accurate.
Okay. Well, we won't be talking about Wally's storyline a lot since it was completely made up. But the first time that we see Wallis meeting Edward in the movie is at it's some sort of an event or party. Again, the movie is kind of vague about what this is that we're seeing. It doesn't give us really a time or place, although it's pretty obvious we're not in Shanghai in 1924 anymore, like at the beginning of the movie. As movie watchers, what we can deduce is that it's an exclusive event. There's some dialogue where Wallis mentions to Ernest that she spent 6 months ingratiating herself to her friend Thelma to get an invitation so that she could meet Edward, although the movie doesn't really explain why Wallis wanted to meet Edward so bad. This is the first time in the movie that we find out that Wallis and Ernest are married when Edward calls Wallis Mrs. Simpson. So that's the clue that she's actually married now. So can you fill in some more historical context around how and when Wallis and Edward met for the first time?
Yes. Wallis married Ernest Simpson in 1928, but in 1931, at a hunting weekend in Leicestershire, so not Fort Belvedere or anywhere else, she was introduced to him at a sort of country house party. I don't think she'd been maneuvering for 6 months, but she certainly was introduced to her friend Thelma Furness. It's certainly true that Thelma, who'd been having an affair with the Prince of Wales, wanted to go off and have an affair with Aga Khan. And so she sort of passed Wallis across to basically keep what she called the little man happy. And Wallis was, I suppose, seized this opportunity to begin to have an affair with him. But I think what Wallis wanted was the financial security and the social, I suppose, exposure she got by being linked to the royal household. I think this was a fling for her and an opportunity to mix in a society that she wasn't used to mixing in. Her husband had quite a modest income. He was not a great socialite, and this catapulted her into society.
Oh, wow. So it was more almost Thelma's wanting her friend to meet Edward than not necessarily, because the movie certainly implies that it's Wallis that is wanting, like I mentioned, 6 months of, to try to get this invitation. It really makes it seem like she's the one that wants to meet Edward, not necessarily Thelma.
Yeah, I don't think it was quite as organized as that. I think Thelma was off and she thought her friend would get on well with the Duke. I don't think she introduced her on the basis they would have an affair. It was just that the Duke would find her amusing, or the Prince of Wales as he was then. So yeah, that's a little bit that's again not quite right.
Huh. Back in the movie, there is one scene that gives a little bit of context. I had to pause the movie to see it, but there is a newspaper headline talking about how the Prince of Wales is outraged by the poor living conditions of the mining community. The date on that newspaper, when you pause the movie, is September 8th, 1932. Since most of the movie really focuses on Wallace and Edward's private life, this is one of the only few times that we see Edward doing his duties as King or Prince of Wales as he's visiting a mining village in South Wales. The impression I got, though, was that Edward was loved by the people overall. Is that a fair assessment of Edward's time on the throne?
Yes. I mean, I think there are interesting parallels with Prince Harry now. He was, a young, charismatic prince who was popular, and things only in a sense went wrong when he met the American divorcee. He had been doing a lot of tours around the empire to thank them for their contribution during the First World War, and to train him as king. And he did have a common touch. He was less stuffy than the others. And it is true that when he was introduced to these Welsh miners, he said something must be done. He didn't follow through with it. And I think this has been slightly sort of exaggerated, his interest in living conditions and the poor. I mean, he was a socialite. That's all. The only thing that interested him were dances and drinking and having a good time. He didn't have a huge social conscience in the way that I think later royals did. So it's certainly true, and the press made a big thing of this comment, something must be done. But he never did anything about it. He never followed it through, tried to get government action. But he was someone who was prepared to use his position as the heir apparent to try and influence politics, but only in favor of Germany, in favor of the Nazis, not in favor of his own people.
Oh, wow. Okay. So almost like he was just doing a lip service, like he's telling the people what they wanted to hear, almost, is what it sounds like.
Exactly. And then it was spun by the palace in the way that so much stuff is still spun to this day.
Yeah. Well, there is some voiceover around that point in the movie that mentions Edward was the king. Then there's the newspaper I mentioned that he's the Prince of Wales. And of course, he's also called the Duke of Windsor in the movie. So for those of us who may not be familiar with all of the titles that he held, can you clarify a little bit since the movie doesn't really do a lot of clarification there, did he really hold all those titles at the same time?
No. He was the Prince of Wales until he inherited in January 1936. He then became King Edward VIII. It's confusing because his first name was David, but he became King Edward VIII, and that was from January to December 1936. And then after that, he was almost immediately made Duke of Windsor. There's one point where they talk about Mr. Edward Windsor or something. He was never that. He was Prince Edward. And I think they actually play part of the abdication broadcast on the film. And he does talk about that. And that abdication broadcast is absolutely the real thing. And in fact, you can hear it on YouTube. But I mean, one of the confusing things about the royals is they don't always take their own name. So, for example, his brother, who was called Albert, became King George VI. It's said that Prince Charles is likely to become King George VII. So they just take the name that suits them.
I will admit that was something that was, it took a second for me to figure, okay, Bertie in the movie is not actually Bertie, like he's called by this other name here, but then same with Edward. But these people are calling him David. But some of them call him Edward because, they don't know him personally enough to call him David, that kind of thing. That was
exactly. And then there's another brother who's actually called George, who's the Duke of Kent. So it gets really confusing.
Of course. Well, speaking of some of that confusion with the name there, we already mentioned that Wallace was married to Ernest. On Edward's side, he wasn't married yet in the movie, but the movie does show him in the relationship with Thelma, Wallace's friend. And then at one point, Thelma goes to America for a few months. While she's away, there are newspaper articles that spread rumors of her having an affair with Alcan. And then even though Wallace tries to convince Edward that Thelma isn't cheating on him, it still bothers him. As I was watching this, I got the feeling that Thelma's trip was really when Edward started to turn his attention away from her, being Thelma, and towards Wallace. And the movie really suggests this when talking about the names. Thelma gets back to England. They have this dinner welcoming her home. Edward accidentally tears Wallace's dress during the dinner. Without thinking, she blurts out, "Oh my God, David, look at what you've done. You've torn my dress." And that catches everybody's attention because only family calls him David. And the movie doesn't really show anything physical happening between them, but is it correct to show that about the time that Thelma was in America was when Edward and Wallace really got close?
Yes, I think it is. The public really didn't know about the relationship until pictures appeared in the press in the autumn of 1936, so literally only a few weeks before the abdication. The whole thing had been kept quiet. I think people in society, there were rumors going around, you can read diaries that talk about the relationship, and clearly the people who were very close to them would have known there was some relationship. He actually sued successfully a paper that claimed that they'd slept together before marriage. But I think it's pretty clear from all the evidence I've seen that they were sleeping together from pretty much 1931 onwards. He was a man, it was a very strange relationship because he really was looking for a mother figure, and she was a very dominant figure. And there was almost a sadomasochistic element to it. So it wasn't really like a normal, conventional sexual relationship.
Just for timing purposes, when was Thelma's trip to America? Was that around that same time in 36 then?
It's 1931.
Oh.
She went off. Sorry, no, it's a bit later. You're right. It's about 1935.
Okay. So it was roughly around the same time then, because the movie kind of ties those two together.
Yes. Sorry, that's about right. Sorry.
While Thelma is away, there's a scene where Ernest gets home and seems surprised to find Edward there with Wallace, and Edward says something about how this shouldn't be surprising. He's been there every night that week. I'm guessing it's not really common for a king to visit your home. Was Edward visiting Wallace as much as the movie shows?
Yes, he was. He shared a flat in central London, and he was often there. And as you say, very unusual because, the king even then had police protection officers. Or the Prince of Wales, his movements were carefully organized, in advance. So, but he would come often quite late at night. I think Simpson couldn't have been surprised. Simpson was well aware of this. Simpson was also a Freemason and actually enjoyed the fact that his wife had the attentions of the Prince of Wales. He thought he would be given some sort of honor for basically sacrificing his wife for the monarchy.
Oh, okay. But I mean, he kind of knew that there was something going on. I mean, I would assume you'd kind of figure that out if people are coming to visit all hours of the night.
Exactly. And he himself was in love with one of Wallace's best friends, one called Mary Rafferty Kirk, who he married after they got divorced in October 1936.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the movie doesn't mention anything about that. It just shows him as being this faithful husband.
Yeah. No, it's much more nuanced than one realizes. This idea that it was this great love affair is not really true. And in fact, the film does bring that out. I mean, she says how difficult it is to live this life when everyone thinks it's a great love affair, and it isn't.
The first time that we see, you mentioned them in public, and the first time we see them in public in the movie is when they take a trip to Italy. Edward assures Wallace that all of these photos, we see kind of reporters taking pictures. He assures her that the photos aren't going to run in England's newspapers. But then a little bit later, we see Wallace walking down the street alone, and there's some newspapers there, and there's headlines like "The King's Scandalous Affair" and "The King and Mrs. Simpson Tour the Mediterranean." And it kind of highlights that she's still married. What was the initial reaction like when people started to find out that Wallace and Edward were together?
I think there was shock because, as you say, a lot of it was kept away from the British public. The newspaper proprietors actually kept the stuff out. And so when they say it began to emerge really after that summer of 36, people then, it was all a great surprise. And I mean, there's still a lot of news management around the royals. We don't get to the full picture of what's going on. But I think that it's all concertinaed then, the disclosures about the relationship in those 3 or 4 months before the abdication in December 36.
You mentioned earlier with Ernest, and there is a brief scene that we see after Edward's visiting and such, that Edward and Ernest have a talk, and Ernest pretty much gives up. He's says he only hopes that Edward will love Wallace as much as he does, and Edward says he will. And for the most part, the movie suggests that Ernest obviously wasn't happy with it, but he didn't really try to get in the way. What was his reaction to Wallace and Edward's relationship?
Well, I think he was accepting of it. Partly because he had his own love affair with Referee Kirk. He was a gent. His expenses for the divorce were covered by the Prince of Wales. So, but he did the decent thing. In those days, you could only get divorced if you were, for example, caught in adultery. So people would go off specially to hotels with a prostitute or someone, in this case with Mary Referee Kirk, and then arrange to be found in bed by the detective, or rather by a member of staff who would then talk to a detective. And so they went through this farce. Simpson went to a hotel just outside London with Referee Kirk and was caught in bed with her, and she was able to sue for divorce. So she looked like the innocent party, but of course she wasn't. So he was a very decent man. We do things very strangely in Britain. It doesn't happen now, but that was what happened then.
Yeah, no, just wrapping my head around that, just that concept of, it's obviously you're just doing it for, okay. That is. You're
doing it just it was a ticking boxes exercise, but, and there's got a lot. I mean, if you look at, for example, Evelyn Waugh, there are all sorts of stories like that in him. So, I mean, it was very well known, and people sort of guessed that it was all a charade.
Yeah, and the poor women who are the ones being used just to tick the box. That's wow. After the newspapers start to break the reports of the scandal, as the headlines call it, we see some scenes in the movies where Edward's parents, King George V and Queen Mary, just aren't happy about Edward pursuing Wallace. How did the movie do showing the King and Queen's reaction to Wallace and Edward?
Well, they don't do very much. There's a moment with Queen Mary listening to the broadcast, looking very unhappy. But I've actually looked at the papers in the Royal Archives, and this is the private family correspondence, and clearly it was a very bitter breakup. People felt that it was dereliction of duty there. They didn't like Wallace. So I was surprised that they didn't do more of that. Wallace, they said, only came back once to Britain for the Duke's funeral in 1972. In fact, she came back once in 1967 when he was alive for the unveiling of a plaque to Queen Mary. But she was very much kept out. He was able to come back and see members of the family, but she never came back and saw them. So again, shades of Meghan, really. Harry comes back to see the Queen, but only until recently has Meghan been allowed back.
You mentioned the public perception initially was shock, but once they kind of got over the initial shock, were they approving? Were they disapproving of this relationship?
No, I mean, there was a song at the time which ran, Mrs. Simpson has stolen our king. And so she got blamed. She was seen to be an adventurer, that she had seduced him, that she was a terrible American divorcee, twice divorced by then. And so, as often happens, the woman gets the blame and the man gets off scot-free. He was the man driving it. She didn't want to marry him. He'd threatened to commit suicide if she didn't marry him. She was there. There is a bit where she pleads with him in the film, saying, "Look, we're not really suited. We should split." And I think what happened was events overtook her, and she got in way above what she expected. She enjoyed being the mistress, but she had no intention of marrying him. But he became so obsessed with her that she really had no choice. And I think the film doesn't really quite make enough of that. It plays into this myth of the great love affair, and she's desperately in love with him equally, and this great, the greatest romance of the century. And that's not what happened. It was about one very self-entitled man trying to get his own way with a woman who had sort of bitten off more than she could chew.
And so the whole charade of Ernest going off and having an affair just to check that box for divorce seems like it almost didn't matter at that point.
Well, he went off and was caught in bed with Mary Referee Kirk, but I mean, he was in love with her and he married her. But there was a lot of maneuvering to make it easy for her to get her divorce, to appear to be the innocent party, and therefore the king to look, absolutely whiter than white. But he was the man who had been pushing this the whole time. I think what's interesting is Wallace and Ernest Simpson continued to correspond even after they were both married to other people and remained very fond of each other.
Okay, so they did have a good relationship then, despite all of this that was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, then, and I think it goes on now, people sort of had multiple, particularly in those sort of circles, had multiple relationships. And, people married and then had affairs and, within the royal family. That was what happened with Prince Charles. He married Diana, but kept on with his mistress. And Diana didn't realize that was the game that was played. So, and the Duke was the same. The Prince of Wales, he had numerous affairs. And Wallace was just another one, but that one became the serious one. Whereas for her, again, he was just another of her flings. And then she got sort of trapped.
You may have already answered this next question, but the movie, if we go back to the movie, Wallace does kind of go back and forth with the idea of even divorcing Ernest. She's discussing it with Edward in one scene, and she talks about how the law says she can't be associated with any man for 6 months. She'll have to live on a cow farm in Suffolk during that time. And then later in the movie, it shows that Wallace writing a letter to Edward saying that she can't make him happy. He can't make her happy. She has to return to Ernest to live a calm life. And so the movie certainly pushes forward that she is kind of the one driving this and she's not really sure. Did she have some indecision?
Yes, she did. I mean, she pleaded with him. And in fact, she fled because of the attention she was getting. I mean, the hostile reaction to her, I mean, there were worries about her safety. Bricks were thrown through a window of her house and things. So she escaped to France. And we do have a scene in the film with her actually going through the mob and actually having to be put under a blanket in the car. So that's absolutely true. She goes to France and in December, early December, and she stays in France until the decree absolute for her divorce comes through in the spring, and then she's reunited with the Duke of Windsor. And that was certainly true. They had to be, in fact, in separate countries. He went to Austria, and then they were reunited in France, where they got married in June 1937. So that bit is true, and she did say, I'm not the right person for you. But he became so obsessive, and I think there's emotional blackmail that she really just felt that she had no choice but to go through with it. But it wasn't a happy occasion. His family boycotted the wedding. There were only 8 guests from Britain, and they were very much isolated, the two of them, against the world, really. The Church of England refused to allow a clergyman to conduct the service. They were completely frozen out. And so in some ways, that behavior brought them closer together. But if it had been played in a more subtle way, I suspect that she might have been able to escape. I don't. This idea that she loved him, I'm afraid, is rather far-fetched.
Wow, yeah, and the movie really makes it seem like they escape together, not that they're escaping separately. Because when you mentioned, her hiding in the car, he's in the car with her.
Well, it's yes. Again, that's inaccurate. It was a man called Lord Brownlow who worked for him. So they again, I don't know why they changed that, because in some ways it's more effective that he isn't there. How could he be there? But there is a good line in the film that in order to escape his prison, the prison of his role as future king, he had incarcerated her. And I think that is true. I mean, he was never very keen to become king. He wasn't temperamentally suited. He had no sense of public duty. And she gave him his escape route. So I think that's certainly true. And in some ways, it also gave the authorities an escape route, because they were concerned about him becoming king. They actually encouraged him to take up dangerous sports in the hope he would be killed. And when that failed, they used the opportunity of Wallace on the scene to basically maneuver him off the throne. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, he couldn't marry a divorced woman. But there were plenty of other options that were open to him. He could have kept her as a mistress. He could have had a morganatic marriage. He could have married her after the coronation. So the abdication needn't have happened, but it suited a lot of people's purposes. He didn't want the job, and other people didn't want him to have the job.
Wow, that's a lot more. There's a lot more politics at play there than the movie makes it seem like he's just straight up doing this out of pure love. Like he wants to hold on to the title, but he's willing to relinquish that for love. And it sounds like maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Well, no, it's not. And that's always been the conventional line. So I was surprised when, I read that Madonna had spent 2 years researching this, because even a few minutes researching it would have shown that was absolutely wrong. But Madonna, like a lot of women, has I think just identifies with Wallace, sees her as a victim of male oppression, perhaps. I think Wallace was a victim of the system and of events and Edward. So I think that's right. But she wasn't whiter than white. She was a social climber. She was pretty manipulative. She took his jewels before they got married. He was very generous to her. So again, one of the concerns with the family, that he was giving her lots of money, even before they got married. And one of the reasons that she wasn't given a title is they thought the marriage wouldn't last, and they didn't want to have two Duchesses of Windsor. So it's a much more nuanced story than Madonna suggests. Now, films clearly have to simplify things, but they make some things more complicated than they need to be, and they simplify things which actually shouldn't be simplified because they're plain wrong.
You mentioned not giving the title. Was she not given the title Duchess of Windsor then?
Well, sorry, she wasn't given Her Royal Highness. As Duchess of Windsor, she should be Her Royal Highness. And in fact, her sisters-in-law were all Her Royal Highness. And the rules were, if you married His Royal Highness, you became Her Royal Highness. But that's the type. But she wasn't bestowed that title. But you're right. Sorry, I should have been clearer. So they didn't want to have two HRHs who were Duchess of Windsor.
Okay, that makes sense. The movie does basically set up the abdication as an ultimatum: either renounce Wallace for all time or step down from the throne. And the movie calls this a constitutional crisis for England. And the movie shows Edward's choice. It takes the time, quite a bit of time in the movie actually, to hear the radio speech to the country just hours after he gave up the title of King Edward VIII of England to become Mr. David Windsor. How well did the movie do showing the actual abdication from Edward?
Well, the abdication speech is absolutely as it was written. It was partly written by Winston Churchill, and you can hear it on YouTube. The scene has his younger brother sort of watching it, and it's done, as they say, from Windsor, but in a lovely room with a fire burning, all very cozy. The reality was it was done in a very cold room in the Tower. It was him alone. He was introduced by the head of the BBC, who literally slid out of the seat, and he slid into the seat behind it. So it was a much bleaker affair than the one presented in the film. And it's clever. They use that in some ways to tell the story. But this is where a lot of the myth comes from, that particular abdication speech, which talks about giving up the throne for the woman he loves. But in his saying that he'll obey his brother and he wishes him well, that's absolutely in the speech. It's not exactly how the Duke of Windsor then behaved. He was constantly trying to upstage his brother. He made life very difficult for him. There's one scene where he's bringing the new king and trying to boss him around. Now that's exactly what happened. He couldn't accept that he was no longer king, and he tried to boss his younger brother around, who was the king.
So he couldn't accept that he wasn't king, but he also kind of didn't want to be king.
Exactly. I mean, he wasn't always very rational, and of course,
okay. Just wanted to make sure I was understanding that. Yeah, that's.
I think he sort of wanted the benefits, the privileges, without, in a sense, doing any of the hard work. But I think one of the interesting things is in my book, Traitor King, which looks at the period after the abdication. He rather regrets giving up the throne. He needs to big himself up in front of Wallace. He feels he's been outmaneuvered and cheated in some ways of his birthright. And that's why he's so keen for the Germans to put him back on the throne as a puppet king should they invade Britain.
Can you clarify the term constitutional crisis for England with that? For those of us who aren't familiar with England's constitution, why was that such a crisis for the country?
Well, it was a crisis because there'd never before been a king who abdicated his throne. And it's almost a sense of divine right. When people are crowned, they're crowned for life. They can't just give it up. and the Queen has said that she will serve till the end of her days. We're going through a period now of what we call soft regency, where she's sharing some of the jobs with Prince Charles, indeed with Prince William. But the idea that a monarch can actually give up something that is in some ways inherited is just not something that's part of the British Constitution. And so this was why it was a constitutional crisis. It affected, clearly this was his birthright, and his job was to follow it through. It became a constitutional crisis also because of the empire. The decisions were required from other Dominion leaders, empire leaders. So that's why they had to take advice from Canada and South Africa and elsewhere, New Zealand and Australia. So it became not just a personal family crisis, but one that involved the government and indeed governments abroad, as well as a religious one, because, of course, he couldn't be head of the Church of England and marry a divorced woman. Now, of course, that's all changed now. I mean, in those days, you couldn't go, for example, to the Royal Enclosure at Ascot, which is one of the big horse racing events, if you were divorced, even if you were the innocent party. There was a huge prejudice against anyone who was divorced. And, of course, later on, it emerges when Princess Margaret falls in love with Peter Townsend, her father's equerry, and she can't marry him, even though he is divorced and he was the innocent party, because he's divorced.
You're talking earlier about how people were almost using this, like he was using Wallis as an escape from the monarchy, and then perhaps others were also not wanting him to be king because he couldn't fit that. And then it sounds like, a lot of laws had to change, or a lot of things had to change, or they had to figure out a lot of things because this sort of thing had never happened before. How long was this process? Because the movie doesn't really have any sort of a timeline for how long this happened, other than the date at the very beginning of the movie. There's not a lot of time.
Well, it moved very swiftly. He abdicated in mid-December and was sent into exile that very night, not to return. And Bertie became the new king and had, was the Acts of Parliament were pushed through literally that day. And he was in Buckingham Palace as king. And his coronation took place in May 1937. It's actually the date that Edward would have been crowned. So it was all pretty ruthless. And I think one of the concerns was that Edward had become a focus for the fascist movement in Britain. And they didn't want him to be around and someone that they could group around. So it was a way of breaking up those fascist groups by sending him abroad and basically keeping him out and freezing him out. But, we have to this day, I mean, it's a shock subject, the abdication. And I think the royal family have vowed it should never happen again, which is why the Queen won't abdicate. I doubt Prince Charles will ever abdicate. So it's the ramifications have gone down through several generations. But in some ways, we've got to remember this is all quite close. This is the Queen's uncle. She knew him. He was her favorite uncle. So for them, it's a very close and rather raw thing.
Yeah, and we do see a younger, obviously, Elizabeth in the movie as well. And she seems to, well, I mean, I guess according to the movie, she seems to at least not be a big fan of Wallis and their relationship.
No, I think none of the royal family were fans of Wallis. Again, what's confusing is that Bertie's husband is called Elizabeth. And the Queen, as she's known, the Queen Mother felt that Bertie's early death was as a result of taking on this burden, which she didn't expect to inherit. She called Wallis that woman. Wallis called her the witch from Glamis, which is a place in Scotland where she came from. So no love lost between the Queen's mother, Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, and I think that attitude was passed on down to the Queen. That's why there was no real reconciliation until 1972. Literally on his deathbed, the Queen, on a state visit to Paris, visited the Duke, I think to try and just mend some of those fences, but also to ensure that material that was owned by the Duke, some of the letters and artifacts, garter robes, things like that, were returned to the royal family, personal things that they wanted back. So in some ways, it's extraordinary. There was such a huge auction in 1998. There was also an earlier one in 1986 in Geneva of the jewelry, because the royal family took 3 lorry loads of material away from the house in Paris after Wallace died in 1986.
You mentioned...
after the Duke died in 1972. So there was a whole-scale sort of clear-out of their stuff.
Okay. You mentioned him being the Duke, and earlier we did talk about the titles. A little later in the movie, when we see David Wallace staying at a room in Paris there, and then later in the 1990s with the fictional, Wally Winthrop storyline, they talk about how the Duke and Duchess of Windsor stayed there. Which of the titles did they maintain after abdicated? Was it only the Duke and Duchess?
Yes, they were always known that was the only title they had, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. So, I mean, normally you would have several titles as a member of the royal family, often an English title and a Scottish title. But he lost all his titles. He lost his life interest in family properties like Balmoral and Sandringham, and the chance of income from some of the royal estates. So his only thing was Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And that's why he was so cross that she wasn't Her Royal Highness. So people didn't, for example, have to curtsy to her, but they did have to bow to him. But the Hotel Meurice, where they did in fact film, is indeed where they used to stay. They got a special rate there, a very generous rate. And of course, it was good publicity for the Hotel Meurice. They also had a lot to do with the Ritz in Paris, often entertained there. They took private rooms there to host dinner parties. So a lot of their time when they were in Paris, they didn't just rent houses, but they also actually had suites of rooms in hotels as well.
In the movie, once he's no longer king, David now is having a hard time getting a hold of his brother on the phone, and he and Wallace are in Paris. They're not able to return to England. And then there's a scene where we mentioned earlier, Elizabeth talking to King George about how David had lunch with Hitler, and that makes people think he's a Nazi. The movie doesn't really explain this very well, but of course, you mentioned your book called Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. So I'm going to assume that the movie is correct and suggest that they weren't allowed back to England. Can you fill in some more historical context around this?
Yes, the deal was that he wouldn't upstage his brother. He would keep out of Britain. Now, the Duke thought that at some stage he would come back, but actually he wasn't allowed to come back ever. Fort Belvedere, which was his beloved sort of country house, was given to someone else, and when he'd hoped that he perhaps could keep that. And one of the reasons he didn't come back to Britain was that he would be taxed, and the last thing he wanted was to have to pay income tax on quite substantial earnings he had. So that was actually quite a clever way of keeping him out. But it is true that almost immediately after the wedding, he made a tour of Germany, visiting SS troops, meeting all the Nazi leaders. He actually had tea with Hitler rather than dined with him at his home in Berchtesgaden. So that's absolutely right. The authorities in Britain were not told about the trip. They just sort of read about it literally as it was about to happen. Now, one argument is it doesn't show that he's a Nazi just because he makes a trip to Germany, but it was a propaganda coup for the Germans. And I think it was one in basically it was 2 fingers to his brother, that he was doing what suited him. And it does give us an early indication of his sympathies. They'd always been suspected of being Nazis. Wallace had been close to a German leader called von Ribbentrop, who was later ambassador in London. He had tried to interfere in politics. He tried to downplay something called the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, when Germany marched troops into an area that he wasn't supposed to be in, and people let him get away with it. So he'd shown always these great sympathies to the Nazis. A number of his German cousins were Nazi generals. And it's clear, again, from looking at the Royal Archives material, that the royal family were monitoring his activities with the Germans. And so it was perfectly feasible for Bertie in 1937 to suspect he was a Nazi, but they didn't realize how much of a Nazi he was until the Second World War came along, and he literally got into bed with the Nazis in the hope that he would be restored to the throne.
Wow. So he was essentially trying to use the Nazis to get back into England and get the title back that he didn't want earlier.
Yeah, exactly. He changed his mind, and the Germans knew this. They targeted him. They offered him millions of Swiss francs, to come back, if they successfully invaded Britain in 1940, to come back as the German leader in Britain, to depose his brother. He, in fact, encouraged the Germans to bomb London as the best way of beating Britain. So he became a complete traitor to his country for his own personal ends.
He recommended bombing London.
Yeah, I mean, we found this in the archives, being reported. We know this because of material in Franco when he was. This was all said to the Germans when he was in Spain and Portugal in the summer of 1940. So we have these events recorded by diplomats down there, by the German diplomats reporting back to Berlin, and that material was found in captured German documents at the end of the war. Also from Franco's own files, because the Spanish were keeping an eye on him, and also the Portuguese Secret Service. We have their surveillance reports and him going into the German embassy, and the intercepted telegrams that were going to and fro. So we have chapter and verse, and also his protection officer was not just protecting him, he was actually reporting on him back to the king and to the authorities in Britain.
Wow. Well, that makes me wonder too, because at the very end of the movie, we see an older Wallace taking care of an older Edward, now David, at their place in Paris. And it's obvious in the movie that David's health is failing. He's on the bed, but they still seem happy. But what you're saying, it sounds like he almost wanted his old life back. Did Wallace and Edward's story end up happily ever after, as the movie seems to suggest?
No, I mean, it's not true at all. He was dying in May 1972, and for the last 2 weeks of his life, he was crying out for Wallace to visit him. And even though her bedroom was 2 doors away from him, she never once visited him in that 2 weeks, according to a woman called Julie Chattard, still alive, who lives in Baltimore, who was the temporary night nurse brought in to take care of him. So this idea that they were sort of a loving old couple, in the film, she actually dances the twist from the 1960s for him, which is ridiculous, because I mean, that wouldn't have happened. I mean, she did wear many skirts in the 1960s, but she certainly wouldn't have danced the twist. But they were sort of rubbing along. I think after he died, I think she realized what she'd lost, because she had nothing. She had no family of her own, no children. She was an only child. So her closest relationship was with an aunt who was long dead. So she was there, and the only family she had was the royal family, who weren't interested in her. So I think she realized that, he was the only thing in her life, and now she'd lost him.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning that you would give this a 2 out of 10. What would you say the biggest historical inaccuracy in the film would be?
Well, I think that the depiction of this being the greatest romance of the century, it was a pretty sordid arrangement, really, of one obsessive man and one woman who was trapped. And they both had affairs before and during the marriage. So she, for example, had an affair literally within months of her marriage with William Bullitt, who was the American ambassador in Paris. She later had a long affair with a man called Jimmy Donahue, who was the heir to the Woolworth fortune and cousin of Barbara Woolworth. So it's just ridiculous to suggest that there were this loving couple that went into the sunset together. They rubbed along, but she was pretty terrible to him. He was often sent to bed in tears. She was cuckolded him publicly, sometimes at a lunch party. There's a story of her leaving with Jimmy Donahue and going upstairs and making love quite noisily while he sits at the dining room table, literally just a few feet away. So she took pleasure in humiliating him. And the more humiliated he was, the more he was obsessed and loved her. So it was a very odd, as they say, sadomasochistic relationship.
Wow. So she clearly didn't love him nearly as much as he loved her. Absolutely
not. No, I mean, she put up with it because he gave her status, he gave her a life. She had no money, no other way of supporting herself, and she loved, the Cafe Society. She loved their very extravagant life. They had a staff of almost 30, 3 cars, and 3 chauffeurs. She would not have had that on her own. And she was not an attractive woman. I think people would even struggle to say she was handsome. Someone said she looked like a playing card. She was very thin and quite brittle. And it was only because he was this rather pathetic, weak figure that she was, and clearly drawn to her for whatever reason. But so she realized she had to stick with him. He was her best bet.
In the movie, one of the ways that they learn things at the end, we see Wally going to meet someone named Al-Fayed, who supposedly has this collection of private letters between the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Do those letters actually exist?
Yes, that's accurate. Okay. The man who owned Harrods here, Mohammed Al-Fayed, took over the lease of the Bois de Boulogne in return for restoring it, because it had become quite run down in the final 14 years after the Duke died, when Wallace was there, but literally living out of one room. And he bought it took it on the basis that he would restore it, but he inherited these letters. In fact, letters were published very shortly after Wallace died. Quite private letters. People were quite critical of these private letters being published, but they are a very important historical source, as Wally in the film says. And in fact, the actor who plays Fayed looks exactly like him. So that bit is absolutely right. And Fayed is still alive now in his 90s. He, of course, it was his son who was killed in the car crash with Diana in 1998. And one of the reasons that 1997. One of the reasons that the auction took place in 98 rather than 97 was because Dodi had died, and it just didn't feel right to have an auction at the same time, so it was delayed.
Save the most difficult for last, perhaps, and it might be most difficult question. If you could change one thing about the movie to make it closer to what really happened, what would it be?
Well, I would change the scriptwriter. And possibly the producer, and write something that was accurate. What would? I mean, it is a very powerful story. It's a much more nuanced and interesting story than the story they presented. They've presented the myth, which in some ways people have been challenging for a long time. I've perhaps gone further than most. So it's really odd that they're just playing the story that was presented in 1936 rather than the story that actually is now coming to light some 80 years later. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like there's a much bigger picture. I mean, they focus, like I mentioned earlier, they focus really on Edward and Wallace together, but they don't talk about the bigger picture of the Nazis, or really even what else is going on in the rest of the world in the 30s that obviously led up to World War II.
Exactly. I mean, it's really weird. I mean, it's focused, clearly around the abdication, and most books are focused around the abdication. They cover the 50 years afterwards, till she died, in only a few pages, which is what makes my book slightly different. But there should have been some reference beyond the brother saying, "I think he's a Nazi," because it's just thrown in without any real explanation. There's one short scene of newsreel, which is accurate, of him on this visit in October 37, visiting Nazi leaders. But they sort of drop it in without any explanation and then don't develop it. And that's sort of one of the problems of the whole film. It throws out odd little bits, and it's very confusing unless you're a bit of an expert. And even a biographer like me is slightly confused times of what's going on. So it's a sort of wasted opportunity, I think, because Wallace, in some ways, I agree with Madonna, was a rather tragic figure. And I think there would have been a lot more. It's hard to get sympathy for her in the film as it stands, when it would have been very easy to paint her as a woman more sinned against than sinner.
Yeah. At least it wasn't me. I was rather confused with a lot of what was going on in the movie, because they throw little bits in here and there, but they don't give much context around it. It's like, oh, he had lunch with Hitler. Whoa, back up a second. Wait, what?
And then suddenly later we have a picture of marrying Ernest Simpson or marrying Win Spencer, but they've already been talked about beforehand without being introduced, and then suddenly they're introduced later on. So I think maybe the film editor should be changed as well.
Go back to changing that. So, well, I'm curious now, because once since Edward, obviously, David lived through World War II. prior to, he was perhaps more sympathetic to the fascists and the Nazis, and with the potential of getting his title back. Do we know what his thoughts were after the atrocities of the Nazi regime came to light, since he lived through that?
Yes, I mean, the extraordinary thing, he remained anti-Semitic all his life. He believed that Hitler was a good chap. When he was touring in October 1937, he actually saw a concentration camp. I mean, you had no illusions about, he wasn't given a total tour. It was a sort of prison or something. But, he would have known from newspapers, which he read avidly, exactly what was going on. He remained friendly with the fascist leader, Oswald Mosley, to the end of his life. And the sort of people he mixed with were very right-wing American businessmen, people like Clint Murchison. So, but, the war comes and people in Britain realize that the only way to deal with Hitler is to fight him. But he's still broadcasting to Hitler on the eve of the war, saying, we want peace. He's intriguing with Nazi spies right through till 1941. Giving them support. He tries to keep America out of the war before the November 40 election by appealing to isolationists. He continues to say, the postal censorship reports pick up all sorts of conversations he has with people. He's posted to the Bahamas as governor during the war to keep him out of the way. But in fact, he's a mischief maker there. He's constantly trying to get to the States and to sow dissension in the States. So he remains a pretty unrepentant Nazi, I would say, to the end of his life.
One of the themes throughout the movie is, from her perspective, there's a couple different times in the movie where it talks about how everybody talks about what he gave up in the throne, but what about what I gave up from Wallace's perspective? Can you talk a little bit about from the movie being more from her perspective?
Yes, I think that's a very good point, and I think that is true. She has this line: people don't ask what I gave up. They just see me as a foreigner who fell in love. They used me to escape his prison, to incarcerate me in mine. So there's some good lines like that, and I think it's a shame those that weren't developed. And clearly, Wally in the 1998 subject, identifies with her in the abusive relationship that Wallace Simpson had been in, not later. The abusive relationship later with the husband. But I think that would have been a theme to really develop, because Madonna clearly is very sympathetic to Wallace, and I think indeed a lot of commentators who've written about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor tend to be more sympathetic to her than to the Duke, who's seen as rather weak and stupid and rather privileged and selfish. But it's one of those things that, again, like so much, is sort of dropped in and not developed. So we get these odd moments where you sort of wait for something more to come, and then they've moved on to something else, which is a shame, because I think that would have been a very strong motif, which would have had some resonance now, in a way. If one was trying to find something that was of contemporary resonance, that would have been the angle.
Yeah, I definitely felt that it was kind of thrown in there. Although I also kind of got the sense that was partially the story they're trying to tell, kind of from her perspective. But the way they show it, what about what I gave up? Well, obviously the first marriage that she had was not a happy marriage at all. And so the only thing that I got that she kind of gave up was Ernest, and because that seemed like a happy marriage in the movie. And so, but it also made it seem like she was perfectly happy with Edward. And so, yeah, she gave up a lot to maybe live this public life, but she seemed like she was happy, especially at the end. I was mentioned earlier, talking about the ending scene. She seemed happy.
It's rather tender, that scene. Yeah. I mean, and, there's a famous moment on the morning after their wedding where she actually comes, they slept in separate rooms. She came to the foot of his bed and looked down to him and said, what happens now? We've now got married. And, she's told friends, how am I going to entertain this man? His life has been used to all the way through to being controlled, things happening, people doing things for him. And now it's just the two of us and I'm responsible for him. And I think she was completely daunted by this. And I think in some ways that Catholic society lifestyle was partly just to keep him occupied. And he was a man who had no interests. So the only thing to keep interested was to have dinner parties. So that, there is stuff in the biographies that would have backed up Madonna's thesis. But for whatever reason, she chose not to go down that route. But we have no real sense of that relationship, as you say, until we have that rather tender moment at the end where she's sort of, he's in bed with various bits coming out of him. And he asks her to dance and bring back his memories of the past. And I think she was a good dancer. They both were. But, that was a scene, I think, that could have been developed. And we had no sense of this being a great partnership, either of being a great partnership or being one where, he was sent to bed in tears. So it was very hard to see what it was all about.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about W.E. We, a moment ago, mentioned your book called Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Can you share a little bit more about your book and where someone listening can pick up a copy?
Yes, of course. Well, they can get a copy, I hope, from bookshops and certainly from Amazon. It's just come out in the States. It's published a few months ago in Britain and got quite a lot of coverage. It was a bestseller here, top 10 bestseller, and was the subject of a documentary made by Channel 4 called Traitor King, which I think is also available in the States. So people can get the story there. But basically, I argue that the period from 1936 to 86, when she died, is actually much more important than people realize. It sheds new light on the abdication. I go through these Nazi sympathies, the way he intrigued against the British government, how Churchill threatened him with court-martial, how he was sent off to the Bahamas where he was involved in covering up a murder, and how these capture these German documents in May 1945 revealed just all the intrigues that he had been conducting with the Nazis going back to 1936. And so I think it paints him in a very different picture. The book also, I think, demolishes the myth of this great love affair, showing this was a very weird relationship, which was certainly not a love affair, in which she bossed him around and he put up with this behavior. How also they were venal. They basically exploited their position for their own commercial advantage as royals. And it's become quite timely because there are lots and lots of parallels with the Harry and Meghan story. So the debates over finances and security, the breakdown of family relationships, the suing of the press, the curation of the story through tame biographers, the unfortunate radio television interviews. All these took place with the Windsors and are being repeated again now, 80 years later.
Wow, yeah. I want to see a movie made out of your book. I mean, that sounds like the story to tell there.
I'd love to come and discuss it with you.
I would love that. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. It's been great talking to you.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Andrew Loney once again for sharing his knowledge about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. If you want to learn more about the true story, make sure to go pick up a copy of Andrew's book called Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. As always, you can find links to Andrew's work in the show notes for this episode, as well as on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, Wally Winthrop's storyline is fictional. Number 2, King Edward VIII's real name was Bertie. Number 3, Wallis Simpson was married twice before Edward. Did you find out which one is a lie? Let's start with number 1. Wally Winthrop's storyline is fictional. That is true. And by that, what I mean is it's true that the storyline is fictional. That's why we didn't really focus on it much during the episode. That brings us to number 2. King Edward VIII's real name was Bertie. That's the lie. His real name was David. Bertie, or Albert, was his brother's name who became King George VI when Edward abdicated the throne. That means number 3 is true as well. Wallis Simpson was married twice twice before Edward. The movie was correct to show that Wallis was married once before she married Ernest Simpson, so that would mean she was married twice before her affair with Edward, who ended up being her third husband. If you enjoyed this episode, you can help support the next episode and get ad-free versions of the show over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.